Hi, everybody, and welcome to the New Westminster Times podcast episode one. We're going to be doing more of this type of content in the future, so hope you enjoy it. Um, my guest today is Jim McMurtry. For folks who follow our paper, you'll be very familiar with Jim and his story. But for other folks, maybe you haven't heard Jim's story, and that's why we have him on today. But just to give you a quick summary, uh, Jim is a award-winning educator uh, who's had an amazing career in education, but a few years ago he ran into a bit of a brick wall in Abbotsford, where he most recently was a high school teacher, and I think we might call it a case of cancel culture. In Jim's case, this was it manifested when Jim um, talked about the Indian residential school situation when the news of the Kamloops residential school graves broke. And he spoke about it in a way that did not meet with the approval of his superiors, and that led to a major conflict and him being out of his job. So, Jim, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, Dave.
So, for folks who aren't really familiar with your story, maybe you could just introduce them to who you are and how you ended up where you are in your life today.
Oh, well, thank you. Those are big questions, and I'll do my best. I like to tell viewers that I'm the son of a fairly prominent politician, Roy McMurtry, who was involved in the patriation of the Constitution and fought for rights and freedoms. And I found myself doing the same now. So it was all very unwitting on my part. I was teaching 3 years ago about Indian residential schools because everybody across Canada was, because the news had broken in of 215 child remains being found in a mass grave. I said the wrong thing and I haven't taught since.
Hmm. So, I think this is obviously a hugely sensitive topic in Canada. Um, I think, for folks who are following the Truth and Reconciliation story in Canada, um, will be familiar with some of the details. But I always assume that folks are kind of up to speed on the dialogue in the country, but I don't think everyone is necessarily. Uh, for example, long before the Kamloops announcement came out in 2021, I think it was June of 2021 or thereabouts, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report um, that came out in around 2016. So presumably, Jim, you would have been familiar with this report and efforts of the government to work away at reconciliation with First Nations over the residential school situation.
Absolutely. And there's been great sensitivity for a long time. When I was in university, I studied Indian residential schools as part of a master's program. And I never heard the things that they're saying now about residential schools. They weren't perfect schools, but nobody was looking at that. They were trying to find what would be the best solution for providing educational opportunities to Indigenous youth and so forth. The residential schools back in time took in orphans, took in kids that didn't have necessities of life back on the reserve, took in a great number of kids who had disease such as tuberculosis. So it was, in many ways, it was an early child welfare system. Um, but since the 1990s, it's become something else. It's manifested into something that's quite troubling for me in the sense that it's a taboo subject, and one is only allowed one perspective. And we had a senator in Canada named Lynn Bayek who simply was of the opinion that there must have been something good about the schools. Now, again, when I was in university a long time ago, of course, people talked about good things, and they believed it was a successful project in many ways to provide education for kids who live too far away from a day school or where they could possibly build a school. Since many northern and western bands in Canada or First Nations are small in number, nomadic, and so it was hard. Some of these kids were placed in residential schools, usually with the application and support of parents. But it's become such a sensitive subject now that if one says anything about Indigenous people generally, um, that is off script, then there can be a very significant consequence. The trouble that I have, Dave, is that what I said on May 31st, 2021, about residential schools, after being asked by my principal to talk about them, because news had broken that day of the reputed discoveries, of which there hasn't been any discovery. In the last 3 years, they haven't found a single unmarked grave. They found the name of a single missing child. They certainly didn't find any bodies. In fact, they haven't dug. The RCMP haven't investigated. The archaeologist's report is sealed. So the whole thing is not real. And yet, all I said in class that day was that those that died while enrolled in residential school a long time ago did so from disease, for the most part. And but it's really it's an interesting thing. It's sort of like, to me, if I had to equate it, I don't know how successful this will be as an analogy, but if one is in Russia today and says anything negative about the special military operation, or even calls it a war, that person will be quickly carted off to prison or worse. So there's that sensitivity present in Canada today that's tantamount, where one has to be very careful about saying anything. And that was true about COVID, and that was true about the trucker convoy, and that's true about all sorts of things. When I was in school, there were taboos, and there were areas that one did not go, no go zones. And so I'm not new to it. I just never thought it would be about um, Indigenous or Indian education policy, because I think our early governments did their best, that they provided an education to people who otherwise would not have received an education. And so to me, it's troubling in another way as well. Not only was my school and my country, because in October 27, 2022, the following year or so, all members of parliament voted to call the residential school project a genocide. So I have a problem as a teacher, as a senior history teacher, falsifying the past. I think kids have a right and a desire to know what happened, and not somebody's fictionalized Orwellian version of it. But also, I think as a teacher, quite apart from the issue we're talking about, I think kids have a right to see things from a number of different perspectives and try and have a deeper understanding of a matter, so we can all get at the truth. I don't think it's good enough when people, it doesn't matter what the subject is. Abortion, for example, that was a hot topic, 20 or in the mid 80s. I remember I was teaching at the time. Um, but you wouldn't go into it and say abortion's wrong, or reproductive freedom is right. You would approach it differently. You would say, here's the subject, let's look at it. Our goal is not to accept or reject any prevailing popular view. It's to understand it and to think better.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That's a great summary, and just something that occurs to me when my understanding, when I read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, something that kind of stood out to me was right at the top. Sir John A. Macdonald was quoted in the report as, be the policy of the government of Canada to, I can't remember the exact words, but the the philosophy was, well, Indigenous people have to be fully integrated and assimilated into Canadian culture so that their culture would be replaced by what's quote unquote Canadian culture. And, to me, that the concept of assimilation and the approach of a government of any country to say, well, we want all of our citizens to be more or less the same. And this kind of concept of equality, that if everyone who's in the country is going to be equal, they have to have equal access to education. So now, much later, here we are in the 21st century, and people are looking back and saying, well, this was the stripping and removing of indigenous culture is tantamount to a cultural genocide. So I similarly bristle at that term because it is a very scary and frightening thing to think of the government of Canada actually participating in a genocide. I personally don't believe that's true, but nor do I necessarily believe it's true that the assimilationist policy was necessarily a good idea. Uh, but on the other hand, I, I hear what you're saying. I'm thinking, well, what else? What other policy could Canada have pursued at the time, rather than providing educational opportunities for all Canadians? I think, from what I understand from history, not everyone, Indigenous people or other immigrants, people coming to Canada, they didn't want to have education foisted upon them either.
Yeah, I there's so much to say. I was sitting at a swimming pool the other day and talking to a woman who was saying her brother went to residential school. And I said, "Oh, are you part Indigenous or Indigenous?" No, she said, there was no other school. She said she grew up in northern Alberta. That was the only school that was nearby. And so he went to a residential school. He didn't stay overnight, but that's where his schooling was. So there are many non-Indigenous kids in these schools, just like there were many Indigenous kids in non-Indigenous schools. The majority of kids, only minority ever went to a residential school. The majority went to a day school or didn't go to any school at all. So, from the perspective of a teacher, I think the terms are really inflated, and I have a different take on this at all. I don't think residential schools were conceptually bad. I'm sure there were things that were bad about them. I know that there was some abuse, and I'm sure there were kids that would rather be somewhere else. That also can be said about schools today. I have taught and went to schools where there was abuse, including sexual abuse. And I know many students in the schools that I've worked at who are very unhappy with the education they're receiving or one thing after another. Kids that are bullied, kids that contemplate suicide because they're friendless or whatever. So I'm not here to in any way be an apologist for the school system, all the residential school system. All I believe, and what I was taught, and which Canadians were believed for a long, long time, was that, as you very wisely said, what was the alternative? And people with this presentism, this new ideology that we have to look back at the past and deconstruct and devalue and destroy in some ways the projects of the work of others. I think it's really unfair. I think what's happened in Canada because of Kamloops, and again, that's what made me lose my job, is if you are going to say that nuns from the Sisters of St. Anne and Oblate priests and brothers and some Indigenous teachers, because there were Indigenous teachers at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. If you're saying, if anyone says, as they did around the world, because the whole world knew about Canada, knew that we put our flags down for almost 6 months, and knew that we called ourselves a genocidal nation, but those people aren't around to defend themselves. And I, from the research that I've done, and I'm part of a pan-Canadian research group called the Indian Residential School Research Group. And all I see is that most of what I'm seeing is nothing that says in any way that these schools were doing the wrong thing. That many Indigenous parents were upset because their kids were on waiting lists to get into their schools. They didn't want the schools to end when they were closed down. Most were closed down in the 1960s. They're very happy to have a free education and boarding for their children. They wanted not assimilation. To me, the Canadian government didn't see it that way at all, particularly in the 1880s when this began. And people have different names for dates for when the schools began. A lot of people say 1883, but that's to me very arbitrary. These schools have been around for over 400 years because they had, from the very first missionaries that came to Canada, they were educating kids in schools, and they had different names. Um, but um, but the residential school system officially in 1883. At that time in Canada, there were so many, particularly in the West and in the North, there were so many groupings that were really struggling, that were starving, that were wiped out in large part by disease, and it was a really difficult time. And most principally tied in with all the settlers coming out and the disappearance of the bison and buffalo, and it was not an easy time. And I think people like MacDonald, who I consider to be the most important Canadian because he put our country together in an extraordinary way, to have been good people. I believe the teachers at the school where all these murders and people have added to it, kids incinerated, kids drowned, kids electrocuted, kids strung up on a hook, all these things that are being said. There's no evidence of any of that. If there's 150 schools over 150 years approximately, there was only one priest that was ever convicted of any sexual assault. There's going to be no one ever accused of torture, no one ever accused of murder. So coming back to my situation, Dave, in 2021, I'm coming to you as someone who went to graduate school, who again studied this in some depth under people who were renowned in the area of educational history and philosophy and so on. And and I feel that I'm somewhat of an authority. And I can tell you there's no evidence of a missing child in Kamloops. There's no evidence of a child ever tortured or whatever. There's no evidence that any of the missionary teachers, these nuns and priests and others, including again indigenous staff, that did any of these bad things. But people didn't care about that. All they wanted to do is say, look, Canada has saw what the US happened. That like the US was looking for its George Floyd moment, looking for its moment for people just to like a 2 minute hate session in 1984, where they had to go against our. It's just an interesting thing, this whole postmodernism, deconstructionism, the whole woke movement of not building up, of not saying the past is being great, let's make it even better. It's the opposite. It's the past is garbage, terrible racist hellhole called Canada. And now what we're going to do is we're going to break it all down and recreate it. And it doesn't work like that. People can't be divorced from their past. And they particularly shouldn't be divorced from the past that Canada has. Again, the men and women that worked in the Kamloops Indian Residential School, they weren't born and raised in Kamloops. They came, many of them from Europe, for it to be their life's work, their mission, their calling, their higher calling. Did they, as you said earlier, did they want to assimilate kids? Absolutely. They thought Christianity was the religion that everybody should have. They thought the English language was important. They thought, obviously Canadian mores were important and so forth. But they did their best. And I think we've obviously a lot smarter than that. We don't want to have a monochromatic culture in Canada. We recognize that everyone's strong with their cultures. But even the suggestion that the teachers ever did that, I think is false, because the languages, the written languages for Indigenous people were created by Canadian missionaries. Now, some at a later date by academics, but it was all the initiative. The early churches, the early hospitals and schools, and so much of what was done for Indigenous kids for hundreds of years were done by the same people that we're now calling murderers. And I would say, before we bear false witness against any man and woman of cloth who worked in those schools, particularly with the charge of murdering the children that they went to save, to raise up, to give them hope and a chance in a modern world, that we should have proof. Otherwise, it's calumnious. To me, it's nothing but it's just malice to say that. And that's my situation. So I've been taught it 3 years as a teacher, and I've had some people help me, including you, because you've been wonderful to me. And but most people couldn't care less about me. That I have been fighting for 3 years to get my job back, to reclaim my reputation, and I have been called all sorts of terrible things. And all I did was the right thing, which was not to lie to kids. If you were to say to me, Dave, and present me with evidence that there was a mass grave in Kamloops, that those kids were murdered, then I would change my tune. But there is no evidence. There still is no evidence. So I have a higher calling myself. My higher calling, and I take it seriously, is for the parents of the children of whom I am in local parentis. Can trust me. And one of the things I think all parents would expect is that I'm not trying to make them into drag queens. I'm not trying to tell them boys aren't boys and girls aren't girls. I'm not trying to put them into raised buckets. I'm not trying to get rid of literature because it might offend somebody, which I don't believe. I'm not trying to, again, falsify history. I'm not trying to lower standards, and I'm not trying to do anything but what has guided us well for so long, which is to fall a longstanding Western Enlightenment values, particularly as an educator. That kids should inquire freely, they should be tested in their knowledge, they should be developed so they can make it in this world, they should be moved toward a higher purpose in life, look for truth and beauty and goodness and light, and not do bad things. That's all I wanted to do. I don't think you help Indigenous people by making up a fiction about they have this wonderful past where it was like the Garden of Eden until these horrible, bearded white skinned people came over on ships. I don't think we do them a service. I think we did the right thing by providing education. And here's the clincher for me. For anybody that says that we assimilated these kids, I go, well, why would someone say that? Because we're still doing that. Indigenous kids and all immigrant kids come into our schools and they're assimilated. They get in trouble if they speak Punjabi or Mandarin in the classroom. Nope, English. If they say, oh, well, I want to do this. I don't want to sit in the same row as a girl because boys sit ahead of them in my culture. We say no. If someone says a bad name about people who are same-sex orientation, we say, no, you don't do that here. In other words, we're proud. Most of us are proud of Canada, of our culture. And I'm proud to assimilate it. But that doesn't mean that people can't be what they want to be, but not in the school. Otherwise, we can't function. The kids can't fit into Canadian society unless they have the language and the tools and the cultural wherewithal.
Mm. Well, why don't we just shift gears a bit here and talk about the larger context of where you find yourself and the residential school conversation in Canada. And a question I always ask myself is, why is it that we're seeing Indigenous activists linking arms with Palestinian activists, which I would consider to be, now it's coming out, that they're actually pro-Hamas activists and protesters? Why is it that we get, fairly radical trans activists also linking arms with Palestinian activists, who then in turn link arms with Indigenous activists? And there's this chorus of no pride in genocide, no peace on stolen land, no. So the themes and the overlapping of messages. Uh, so trans activists will say, well, by you are by disagreeing with the ideology, you are erasing my existence. Or so this kind of concept of complete obliteration of an entire people. So these kind of key messages are reinforcing each other in society and creating this kind of uh, I don't know, I think of it as a bonfire. It's like if you take these messages of genocide and obliteration and murder and death, and they all fuse together. So, what do you think about that, Jim? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing these kind of, I guess, the decolonial narrative taking over and almost being the prime narrative in the culture today? That colonized and colonizer.
But you said something that I may jump on, but not only if you're a lot smarter than I am, Dave. So I enjoy listening to you. But I'm anxious to jump in as well. But I love what you just said there about D, and I've used that earlier. Deconstructionism, um, destroying, devaluing, decolonization. D. D means to take away from. I as a parent didn't do a perfect job, but my kids never tried to destroy my house. They never thought the answer was in getting rid of the parents. They never thought it was burning down or taking my little statuettes and breaking them. I don't think you build a better country by destroying it. And nobody in any sense does, except for people who are true revolutionaries. So why is the revolutionary message fashionable? Because that's really what it is. Hamas didn't go to the Israeli government and say we're unhappy and this is what we'd like to do to improve situation for our people in Hamas. They took 1,200 people to their death. They tied women to trees and they took as hostages little babies and who are likely dead today. And so I would say to anybody who thinks the answer is in D, is in taking away, I'd say, whoa, I'm not with you. I'm not with you. And particularly when you look at Canadian schools, if anybody here says, well, those schools, the schools, residence schools weren't very good, I'd say to them, okay, how would you have made them better? Would you have gone back and told people back 100 years ago or 150 years ago to pay more taxes or to pay income tax because they didn't have income tax back then? Like, tell me where you would have got the money to magically make everything perfect. It's like Justin Trudeau going, "Oh, 100 years ago, these people were homophobic." Why would like Justin Trudeau go back 100 years ago and explain to some pioneer about homosexuality? It's just people did their best. I think Christian values. I myself, I'm not representing anything other than pedagogical values, the values of a teacher. But I don't think we should think that anything about Canada or Christianity is altogether bad. Of course, things get better over time, and they need to, and in lots of different areas. I say our schools are still failing kids. I've had a number of kids die at the schools that I've been at, including one boy recently at a basketball game where there wasn't a defibrillator. So my point is, we can always be better. Now, to come back specifically to where you move this to, that this Israel and associated with the indigenous people. I don't blame indigenous people. I blame these whatever one calls them, these woke communist fanatics who think the answer is to take one group that's done rather well, which is whatever European males in Canada, and say they're the demon and they need to be stripped of everything and we'll replace them. It doesn't work that way. I like what Burke said about society being organic. And if you're going to make changes into it, you got to do it in little bits and pieces. Otherwise, you'll kill the whole organism. And that's what these people are going to do. If Indigenous people are serious about getting reducing the suicide rates and the fetal alcohol syndrome incidents and the spousal abuse and the unemployment, on and on and on in their lives and their reserves, and in the cities where many of them come and live unsuccessfully. The answer isn't in demonizing any group. So I would say Hamas was wrong in thinking that there's an enemy, and all you have to do is to rise up against them and commit atrocities. And indigenous people, when they blocked railways, or they or anything at all, or block streets, or do anything to disrupt Canadian life, that's counterproductive. I think most Canadians see it that way, and I think it's absolute abomination of leadership by Hamas and in Canada among Indigenous chiefs, when they think that they serve their own people by bringing about war. And yet people have done that from the beginning of time, thinking that there's an answer in revolution, there's an answer in picking up arms and going against. I think, as I met a Vietnam War veteran, and he came to my classroom, and he said to the kids, I was in this war and so forth. And he said, who won the Vietnam War? Grade 6 kids. And some said Vietnam, and some said the Americans. And he looked at them and he said, nobody wins a war. You're both wrong. So I don't believe that the answer is in condemning and vilifying men and women who gave their adult lives to help Indigenous children have a leg up in this world. I think that's an absolute absurdity. And if I've lost my job for doing that, good, because I think I've achieved something that I'd far rather do something of good in this world than to sit quietly in a classroom and participate in the triumph of what I consider to be evil. Kids deserve to know the truth. And that doesn't mean, Dave, and we've always gotten along because we've disagreed on things, but I don't insist that you have my views and you don't insist that I have your views. And I don't do that in the classroom either. If a kid asks me what I think about something, I would say, well, have you considered this or that? Or, well, I'm not myself, I'm more wedded to Canadian cultural practices, respecting, let's say, equality between the sexes. I'll say things like that. What's your view? And in the end, go away and live your truth.
Mm.
But didn't allow me, a guy with a senior teacher with 4 university degrees, they didn't allow me to provide an intelligent, established commentary on residential schools because I was going to say something positive.
Mm.
Like, and I didn't even say anything positive, but they sensed that I was moving in that direction. It's just the most extraordinary thing, Dave, that the people in power in Canada, starting with Trudeau, think that they are smarter than the rest of us. They're more virtuous. And all they need to do is just get rid of all the dissenters. They need to, like Winston Smith in 1984, you just got to, if you don't destroy them, at least destroy their ability to remember what Canada was like. And I
Mm.
feel that that's what's become being a teacher in Canada. They're all going, well, remember when we were focusing on academics? Remember when we read stories like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Now you can't even find in many schools Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because there might be a word or an illustration. Oh, it's anti-fat because there's this one character, Augustus Group, the biggest anyhow. Um,
Okay, so here's another question for you, Jim. So we've just had Canada Day yesterday. Well, you have spent your career working with young people. What do you think it does to young minds to have, particularly the educational system, um, painting a very negative picture of Canada? I'm coming to you today from New Westminster. We live near a park called Queen's Park, and typically year over year, there would be a huge number of activities for Canada Day in the park across the street. Whereas yesterday, there were no activities. There was nothing. There was apparently the day before yesterday, there was a Indigenous teacher there talking about the Turtle Island legend. Um, so you see people in the media posting things like so-called Canada and no pride in genocide. And Canadian flags that have indigenized graphics in them, or upside down Canadian flags. What does it do to young people to grow up in an educational system where their own country is painted as this dark, sinister place?
Well, you once again expressed that with such beautiful articulation. If I may myself just talk about my family again.
Right.
So I did my best to raise three kids.
Mhm.
They went through periods in their lives as teenagers, maybe before, I don't know, where they weren't happy about one thing or another. And they saw things in the family that weren't positive. An uncle this, grandfather that, or whatever. Like there's, someone died. Like there's a lot in life that's heavy.
Mhm.
And I think that wears on young people because I don't think they have the tools that people like us, a little bit older, or a lot older have. I think my story, the day they walked me out of my school, I was sitting and thinking what you were thinking right now. I I was going, we're telling these kids that these residential schools murdered, just in one school alone, teachers murdered 215 kids. Think of how many others were doing the same in all these other schools. And the things the kids were telling me, the other teachers in the school were saying, it was just horrifying. Some kids were indignant, other kids weren't even in class, they were just wandering the halls, raising their voices. Some were putting on face paint, and some kids were depressed, some were crying. Others weren't even at school because their parents didn't want them at school because it was the every we were it was an interesting display of moral hysterical panic where everybody had to bathe in it for a period of time. And then somehow, and it's what Trudeau and others think, somehow we're going to be better for it. Some sort of catharsis will result. That we have seen how low we can be, and then we're going to rise from it. This is very sort of religious, sort of um, ambiance to it all. And I just come back to my family. I worked hard to lighten my children's lives. I told jokes. I did silly antics. I still do. I keep things light. If you don't, then you worry. I've lost a nephew to fentanyl, and that wouldn't have happened if he wasn't depressed. So the reality is, kids, the leading cause of death for teenagers isn't car accidents. They say it is, but it isn't because some of them kill themselves in car accidents. But if you add up all the teenagers that die of drugs, that die from just killing themselves one way or another, or die in a car accident, that is the number one problem. So why would we, again, bringing it back to my situation, why was it wrong for me to say to kids, look, back in time, a lot of children died. 150 years ago, only one in three children, sorry, I've got that right. Yeah, one in three children made it to age 5. So this idea that that people back in time were bad is misplaced, and they did their best. But look at we've done today. Today it's infinitesimally small the number of children in our society that don't get to the age of 5. But it was an interesting thing that became an allegation against me. An allegation against me that I was talking about comparing death rates from today to back in time. In other words, I went off script in the off script because I present, didn't want to demonize not just the teachers in these schools, but all of Canada back in time. So if the Palestinians, to your point, think that good parenting is to put their kids into the costumes of jihadists and have them play toy soldiers and so forth, or indigenous kids thinking that all of the bad that's come to them in their world it comes from white people or non-indigenous people. You don't do these people. You create hatred that's only going to consume them ultimately. Because I don't think others are responsible. I've had problems. I don't even my own situation being losing my job. I don't blame individuals. I'm better than that. I certainly some individuals have contributed more than others, people that run our institutions, but I don't think that's the point. Those people have good qualities as well. I think what we need to do with young people and with all people is, first of all, give a fair account of history. And secondly, give a fair account of the people, who created this beautiful country. I walk anywhere, I'm safe. If I get hurt, I've got the police, I've got hospital people. I'm just I have beautiful restaurants, grocery stores. How can we say that we're going to decolonize this? And there's so many Palestinians that are on social media who say the same thing, but they can only do it, once they're out of Palestine or out of Israel. They say the same thing, and they say, look at Israel. Look at where the Jews live, which is green and democratic and affluent. And look where we live. And you said you were going to give us what the Jews have. And you chose to do that by destroying what the Jews have.
Yeah, I think the what you're talking about there about decolonization, the D words. Um, I think you're right. It's not the indigenous people who are glomming on to the sort of pro-Hamas movement. It's the other way around. They're seeing that um, the message of the evil colonizer, the demons who uh, I wrote an article about a gentleman in Powell River, an indigenous, former chief of the Klamath First Nation, who said to me in an interview that white people are subhuman. Well, how did he get this? What was it that caused him to think of white people as less than human? It's this idea that um, this culture was so toxic and horrible that it committed a genocide. So you see this idea of, well, if the society is so completely evil and you have this, white supremacist um, oppressive regime that is so completely entrenched in the status quo, like you said earlier, the only path forward is a revolution. So you can't reform something that is so completely evil. And something that I heard a fellow named, Sam Sullivan, the former mayor of Vancouver, said the other day. I heard him say that decolonization is the opposite of reconciliation because you say it is destroying, removing, and completely the complete demonization of a culture. So how do we get past all this? How do we
Well, can I
how
just
do
play on
we
that?
yeah.
The one idea to me, I recently somebody sent to me a little video clip from Planet of the Apes.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And so the Planet, but it's just quite interesting. You've got one group that thinks that the answer is in completely destroying. I think that's what we had with the Romans when they fell in 476, that you had all the barbarians come in. And then 500 years later, people are scratching the surface somewhere and going, what's this? Let's dig up. What's it? A Colosseum, an aqueduct, a book. What are these things? And so the reality is, I worry that this isn't going to take society forward. I think that Sam Sullivan, it's not only the opposite of reconciliation, it's the opposite of progress. So it's odd that the progressives are the one that are doing it, because I couldn't imagine anything more aggressive than in turning people against themselves, against their own society. What's left? What can people feel proud about them?
Yes, and getting back to Canada Day, I remember um, you probably remember 1967. I was just 7 years old at the time, but during the Canadian Centennial,
I was
Uh,
there.
right. I remember all the songs and all of the incredible celebration of everything that it means to be Canadian. Uh, I've got a copy of the Vancouver Sun from 1967. It's the commemorative centennial edition, and the front cover is this incredibly beautiful Indigenous art. It's quite striking, and it's full color, and it's amazing, and it's just chock full of stories about this great country. So that that's the 60s when we had, a cultural revolution across the world, but still at that time. Um, so now um, I just worry, like you say, about kids who, um, have this kind of dark uh, darkness that's kind of uh, permeating the idea we have a oppression of, we have a genocide of trans people because we have the day of trans remembrance as if it's akin to Holocaust Remembrance Day. And maybe that's another analogy that gets thrown around a lot, is this concept of genocide, in my opinion, takes away from the actual Holocaust. So we're in a time when anti-Semitism is exploding, and the significance of the Holocaust and its murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis is now kind of a footnote to the horrors of the Canadian government's program. So, how did things get so completely upside down, Jim?
Because people are dishonest. And I'll give you an example of dishonesty. The problem with anti-Semitism is getting worse because we have a lot of people from countries have learned nothing but how horrible the Jews are. So people
Mm,
won't want to talk about that because it's saying we're demonizing. Oh no, you can't say that one intersectional group is responsible for the tormenting of another group. And so this is the we can't even be honest. And I know that there. I was reading um um forget who it was, but a very important writer who is talking Belloc, Hilary Belloc, who is saying that Muslims have taken over every country. They're in 49 countries. All of them were at one time Christian. It's a later religion. I'm not blaming Muslims. They were expansionists. Christians were expansionists. And people are expansionists and in good ideas, bad ideas, whatever. But every single country that Muslims are in today were once majority Christian countries, or where Christian was the dominant language, religion. And certainly all the ones all around Israel. They were, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. They were Christian, and there were tons of Jews. There were Jews all over North. They're gone. So we bring these people in large numbers and become a significant voting bloc. And Trudeau goes, we got a problem with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So what you're trying to say is the moment you're saying the moment we've got a problem, you're making sure that nobody goes toward the solution. The solution is first and foremost telling people in the mosque to stop saying bad things about Jews. That's true. Here's another one. And again, I'm the type of guy. There's nothing. Nobody can do anything to me. I'm just going to say things as they are. And mainstream media has failed everybody in Canada because in so many issues they won't be honest. Like this nonsense again. There's a genocide in Canada because one person, made up a story about kids. 250, not just bodies. They're all kids. Some as young as 3. Boy, that's amazing. You can figure all that out without digging and without any family ever saying, "Oh, I'm missing somebody." But here's another one that I think that people are incredibly dishonest about because you mentioned trans. They say, "Oh, it's terrible that some kids aren't being given puberty blockers or they're not being moved toward bottom or top surgery and all these things, all this mutilation, all this destruction of children, moving towards sterility and all sorts of things. They say, if you don't provide gender affirming care, then you're going to make those kids even more depressed. They're already depressed at a higher rate. And I go, I bet they are, because these are troubled kids for probably all sorts of reasons. Some maybe because of gender dysphoria, but 99% because of other things. And but the thing that's fascinating here is you go, well, then if you're thinking that it's going to help them by giving them, changing their body and having family and everybody else reject them, go through, and never have their own families. So you do that, you know for certain that they're not going to be more depressed 10 years later. So that's the question I'd ask if it was my own kid. I would say, oh, my kid's depressed. I don't like that. How can I make that better? If someone said to me, your kid is going to be less depressed by having this surgery, and for the rest of his or her life is going to be less depressed by changing sex, then I would think then that's probably the right thing to do. But the evidence is the opposite. That so many of these people that do radical things to themselves at a young age when they're not adult enough to make decisions, that they have deep regret. I think that's probably true of people even get tattoos at age 10 or their ears pierced. And my point is simply we can't have honest discussions about all sorts of things. And then another allegation against me in my case. So my case is so I was watched at a classroom, literally by two male vice principals, came and told me to get my stuff and walked to the parking lot with them. And so what's fascinating about this is I've only gotten stronger, not only because I'm on Twitter and I'm hammering away and saying whatever comes to my mind, whatever somebody intelligent, publishes and say, look, I'll put it out as well. Um, but what they're doing is they're delaying my case. So it's been 3 years since I've taught. And and that's what they do with power, is they're making me disappear because I am a truth teller. I don't walk around telling myself I'm this and that. I'm no different than anybody else. But I'm one of those few Canadians who will say, no, I don't do land acknowledgements. No, I don't use pronouns. No, I don't butcher the English language and go they when it should be he or she. I don't do anything that's not in accord with my own sense of self, my own personal philosophy. That's how I teach. I say to kids, look, maybe pick up, don't litter, blah, 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 and work harder in school. Or I say all these things to kids, but at the end of the day, to thy own self be true. And what's wrong right now, more than anything else, because there's always going to be problems, is they're saying to teachers like me, we don't even want you in the school system. And all I did was ask questions. Instead, they'd rather have somebody in the classroom, a teacher, that's telling kids about how wonderful it is to be pansexual. There's tons of examples of that. They had that teacher in Oakville, Ontario, who wore breasts down to his knees with nipples longer than my finger. And all that was fine. And there's something wrong with me going into the classroom and telling kids, well, let's understand it a little bit better. Let's have a conversation. Let's debate. Let's inquire. Let's consider for ourselves, this societal problem. They don't want that in schools. They don't want that. They want kids just to have, nope, this is how you think, kid. Next, give me the next kid. It's absolutely shocking that I'm here, that I'm here on a beautiful sunny day, where when I should be either out running around, I don't know, doing what, or I should be in a classroom teaching. But I can't do those things right now because I'm here with you, and I'm here with you because you're giving me an opportunity, Dave. Because you're a guy who cares about your society. You're giving an opportunity to a dissenter, somebody who is being rejected by society, to speak. Very grateful for that. And I don't think there's anybody, I haven't met anybody. I would love to challenge anybody at any time to say to me at any time that something I've said is factually untrue. I would never
Yeah.
do that with students. And if I did, if I said something and a kid proved me wrong, and that's happened in the past, and get the date wrong and something, whatever, and some kids, oh, Mr. McMurtry, I think it's this. And I go, oh my gosh, thank you. And like my point is, it's all about trying to know my dad before he died. The former Chief Justice of Ontario, he said about my case, is the last thing he said. And I rarely talked to him about my case because I was embarrassed by it, because I didn't want my father to think of me in his dying days as a fired teacher. But the last thing he said was, what should matter is that people get at the truth.
Hmm.
He didn't say what
Wow.
should matter is that Jim gets his job back or my son. Blah, blah. He said the truth is what matters. These values, truth and goodness and beauty and equality and justice and all these things that we grew up with. And now the books that teach us those things, like To Kill a Mockingbird, where I live in Surrey, I taught in Abbotsford, I live in Surrey, they just banned that from schools. Like what is, it's some absolute madness in the schools. They're taking away the best literature that can teach people to think for themselves. I don't have the answers. That's not my job. My job is Socratic, to ask questions and point the way.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Jim, for your voice. You are speaking the truth, I believe. And what you're saying transcends a number of issues of importance in society today, matters of public interest. And, I think what you speak out about, um, you know, uh, Indian residential schools, that history, the trans activist movement, for example, and the other, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think there's a common thread amongst them all, and it's that somehow it's that Western society, our society, is a toxic society that needs to be overthrown and repudiated and called and quote unquote the word is dismantled. So whereas I think you are correctly seeing that and just simply questioning, well, why dismantle what? Why are we dismantling a culture and a society that everyone is currently enjoying? Right? We are we have a positive culture and society, and I think a lot of people are inspired by you to speak out because people are afraid. They're living in fear of prosecution potentially with the Online News Act and the Online Harms Act and all of this legislation that is aimed at uh, our small newspaper. Uh, we're not. Are we in the crosshairs? There's people like yourself, our other columnist Amy Ham, who speaks up a lot on various issues. So yeah, thank you, Jim, for your voice. Um, but I really hope that more Canadians find their voice and speak out. So what do you have to say to all those people that are thinking, I wish I could say that, but I don't think I can say it. That's not me, or I don't have that gift. What do you have to say to people who are thinking, I resonate with that, but I don't know what to say or how to say it?
Well, it's really hard to fight against things when you're younger than I am, because you have kids to support, pay tuition for and so forth, mortgage. You can't really do it. And that's the sad thing. It's really become rather oppressive. They will destroy you. They will take your job away if you insist upon doing what is, in my case, educationally right. But if I could leave you on this note, and I hear it often, and it's the one thing that makes me proud. They picked on the wrong teacher. because I'm too old. I can make it in this world without anybody. I'm going to do what's right for my students. There's going to be, they can't buy me out. They can't threaten me anymore. They can't do anything to me. I'm going to insist that teachers will have the freedom and the right and the comfort in the classroom to simply converse freely once again with students, to read great literature, to tell the truth.
Okay, Jim McMurtry, we will leave it there. And I'm sure this will be the first of many conversations. And I really appreciate taking time on this sunny day after Canada Day. And all the best in your fight out there with your own school district, and just, being a light and a force to be reckoned with in this country. So with that, we will sign off. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much.